In a quiet suburb of Florida, two men posing as home inspectors go door to door, conducting their so-called inspections. They've been running the scam for months, preying on the fearful and the vulnerable, slipping into homes, and vanishing with stolen valuables. But today they've made a deadly mistake. Because behind this door isn't a frightened homeowner. It's a federal agent with a gun on his hip and no patience for con men. What happens next will make them wish they had never knocked. If you like this content, please click like and subscribe to the channel. The knock wasn't friendly. It wasn't the casual rap of a neighbor stopping by to borrow sugar, or the hesitant tap of a delivery driver unsure if he had the right house. No, this was different. 3 sharp, heavy pounds against the front door, authoritative, insistent, enough to rattle the glass in the nearby windows. It wasn't asking. It was demanding. Nathan Carter, standing barefoot in his kitchen, paused mid-sip of his coffee. His grip on the mug tightened just slightly, muscles in his jaw flexing out of pure instinct. Too early for visitors, too early for trouble. His first thought, maybe Mrs. Reynolds from 2 doors down, here to complain about the unkempt look of his truck, parked near her pristine, flower-lined driveway again. Or maybe it was that one guy, Brandon, whose lawn looked like it had been plucked straight from a country club, always finding an excuse to remind people about proper community standards. But neither of them would knock like that. Then came the voice. Homeowners Association inspection. Open up. Nathan's entire body stiffened. The words hit wrong, discordant like an out-of-tune instrument. Hoa. He didn't live in Hoa. That was the whole reason he bought this house, to avoid the petty fines for leaving his trash bin out an hour too long, the absurd restrictions on mailbox colors, the clipboard warriors micromanaging every inch of his property. But now, somehow, these men thought they had the authority to inspect his home. That alone told him something was off. He set his mug down with deliberate ease, the ceramic clicking softly against the countertop, and moved through the living room. Years of training told him one thing observed before engaging. He didn't cast a shadow in the sidelight window, didn't make a sound. Instead, he positioned himself at the peephole, silent, watching. 2 men stood on the porch. Identical navy blue polos, embroidered with Home Inspector and thick white stitching across their chests, tucked into standard-issue khaki pants. But something was wrong. Their badges clipped to their belts looked too shiny, too cheap. The kind you order off a website that also sells fake diplomas and doctor's notes for skipping work. His eyes flicked between them. The tall one Eric stood with his arms crossed. Mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes. His posture too stiff, too rehearsed, like a man playing a role he wasn't quite sure how to sell. The other mustache was stockier, his stance wide, chest puffed up like he was trying too hard to make himself look bigger. Aggressive, challenging, the kind of guy who expected obedience simply because he demanded it. Nathan didn't open the door. Hoa doesn't have jurisdiction here. His voice was calm, even. A pause. A shift. Eric turned slightly toward Roy as if waiting for backup. Then, smooth and confident, his voice came again. Sir, this is a mandatory home inspection. We need to verify compliance with neighborhood safety regulations. Nathan nearly laughed. Safety regulations? Another pause. This time Mustache stepped forward, lowering his voice as if he thought dropping an octave would make him sound more authoritative. Sir, you can either open the door or will be forced to enter by authority of the Hoa Security Division. And there was a moment a petty scam turned into something dangerous. Most people would have panicked. They would have cracked the door, asked questions, maybe even let these 2 frauds step inside, just far enough to shift the balance of control. But Nathan wasn't most people. He was a federal agent, and what they had just done that was attempted illegal entry under false authority. He took a slow breath, measured steady. Then his voice dropped into something colder. You got a warrant? Silence. Eric's grip on his crossed arms tightened. Roy blinked too many times in a row. Then a scoff, a weak attempt at brushing off the question. Sir, we don't need a warrant under Hoa bylaws. Wrong answer. Nathan flipped the lock. In one smooth motion, he swung the door open. The fake inspectors froze. For the first time, Savior got a clear look at them, and more importantly, they got a very clear look at him. Not some clueless homeowner. not a retiree they could intimidate into compliance, not an easy mark who'd let them in without question. No, he was a federal agent, badge in his hand, gun on his hip, expression unamused. And just like that, they knew they had picked the wrong house. For a second, neither of the imposters moved. The air between them hung thick, buzzing with the weight of realization. This wasn't what they had planned for. This wasn't going to be easy. They weren't dealing with fear anymore. Eric's mirrored sunglasses didn't hide the way his eyes had gone wide. His jaw twitched, lips parting slightly like his brain was trying to process too many possibilities at once. Taw their way out of it. Roy, standing rigid beside him, swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. His fingers flexed at his sides, tension rippling through his forearms. Nathan saw it. That split-second panic. That flicker of fight or flight. They were trying to decide whether to double down on a lie or cut and run. Roy was the first to recover. His hands lifted slightly, not all the way up, not surrendering, just hedging his bets. This is a misunderstanding, he said quickly, his voice carefully measured. We're just conducting a safety check. Nathan stepped forward, slow, deliberate. Eric instinctively took a step back, just a small one, but enough. His back hit the porch railing. No easy escape route now. You know impersonating an official is a federal crime, right? Nathan's voice was even, controlled. No yelling, no threats, just fact. Eric licked his lips. His head tilted slightly, but he didn't answer right away. A stall tactic. A nervous till. Sir, wrong answer. Nathan didn't waste time. His hand moved behind his back. The clink of metal as he pulled out his handcuffs was deafening in the quiet morning air. And that's when everything changed. The second the cuffs came into view, everything shifted. The air thickened, pulsing with an invisible tension that settled in the space between them. Nathan saw it the way Roy's fingers twitched at his sides, the way Eric's jaw clenched just a little too tight. They weren't just two scam artists running a petty-con. No, these men were dangerous. And now they were cornered. Roy moved first. His hand twitched toward his waistband. A move so instinctive, so practiced that Savior knew exactly what was coming before it even happened. Don't. The command cut through the air, sharp and absolute, a voice forged from years of field experience, the kind that didn't ask for compliance, it demanded it. Mustache hesitated, fingers hovering just an inch in the grip of his weapon, eyes flicking between Nathan's gun and his own, calculating. Eric had already taken a full step back, his hands shooting up, palms out, lips parted like he wanted to disown whatever stupid decision his partner was about to make. Nathan's aim never wavered. Let it go. Silence. Roy exhaled sharply, a slow, shaky breath through his nose, jaw tight with defiance. But then, finally, his fingers relaxed. The gun clattered onto the wooden porch, the sound cutting through the thick morning air like a judge's gavel slamming down on a final verdict. Eric let out a breath he'd been holding, his body slackening just enough to betray the sheer relief coursing through him. But Nathan didn't relax. Not yet. Step back. His voice was ice, unmoving, unwavering. Mustache did as he was told. But his nostrils flared, his lips pressed into a hard, thin line, his chest rising and falling with a slow, barely contained rage. Nathan recognized that look, the kind of anger that didn't come from fear. No, this was something else, something deeper, the kind of anger that came from a man who wasn't used to being put in his place. Eric, on the other hand, was already in survival mode. His whole body screamed submission. His hands still up, his back pressed against the porch railing like he was trying to physically shrink away from the situation. Look, man, Eric started, his voice wavering just slightly. This is just a misunderstanding, all right? Nathan cut him off with a slow, humorless shake of his head. Shut up. Eric, shut up. Nathan kept his gun trained on Roy as he moved, keeping his stance wide, calculated, practiced. With one swift motion, he kicked the discarded gun across the porch, out of reach. Then, only then, did he allow himself to glance toward Eric, hands where I can see them. Eric nodded quickly, complying without hesitation. Good. Nathan flicked his eyes back to Roy. Now you down on your knees. Roy's nostrils flared again. He didn't move. On your knees, Nathan repeated, his tone dropping into something colder, deadlier. Roy swallowed hard. For a moment, Nathan thought he might actually push back, might actually test the waters of just how far he could go before the situation turned into something irreversible. But then, finally, his knees bent. He sank down slowly, controlled, but his expression never changed. Defiance, resentment, rage. Nathan wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what this was. Eric and Mustache hadn't just knocked on his door, expecting an easy payday. They had knocked on his door, expecting only interaction. They were used to men like him being afraid of them, being intimidated by them. The seconds stretched, heavy and thick. And then, just as Nathan reached for his cuffs again, Eric cracked. Come on, man. Look. His voice was rushed, desperate, words tumbling out his mouth, like he was trying to keep himself from drowning. We didn't know you were a Fed. All right. We weren't targeting you. We were just doing our thing, running a little operation, yeah, but we didn't mean any. Nathan let out a slow, measured breath through his nose, his patience wearing thin. I said, shut up. Eric's mouth snapped shut, so fast Nathan almost laughed. He didn't. Instead, he reached down, clipped the first cuff onto Mustache's wrist, then twisted his arm behind his back with kind of precision that wasn't careless, wasn't aggressive, just effective. Roy gritted his teeth, but said nothing. Eric, on the other hand, was practically vibrating with anxiety now. Look, man. Nathan yanked Roy's other arm behind him, cuffing it in one smooth motion. You see, Nathan said, voice calm, casual, conversational. If you two were just a couple of dumb bosses running a cheap scam, you might have walked away today. Eric swallowed hard. But then you had to go and bring a gun into it. Silence. Eric's throat bobbed again. Nathan stepped back, just slightly, before motioning toward the discarded gun with a barrel of his own. That's going to get you time. A lot of time. Mustache still wasn't talking, just staring. Eric, though he was thinking. Nathan could see it happening in real time. The mental gymnastics, the last-ditch effort to flip the narrative, to somehow find a way out of this. We didn't mean anything by it, Eric rushed out. Come on, man. We thought you were some homeowner. All right? We thought. He cut himself off, jaw clenching. But it was too late. Nathan tilted his head slightly, studying him. You thought what? Eric's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. Nothing, he muttered. But Nathan knew. He knew. You thought I was an easy target. You thought I'd be scared. You thought I'd let you in. But you thought wrong. Nathan exhaled slowly, then reached for his radio. Dispatch, he said, voice cool, controlled. I've got 2 suspects in custody for attempted illegal entry fraud and possession of an unregistered firearm. I'll need backup at my location. Eric's shoulders slumped, Mustachio's jaw ticked. And just like that, the game was over. 15 minutes. That's how long it took for the first squad car to arrive. Long enough for Eric to start sweating through his cheap polyester polo. Long enough for Roy's breathing to turn slow and deliberate, controlled, like a man trying too hard to mask his rising panic. Nathan didn't rush them, didn't speak, didn't move except to occasionally adjust his grip on his firearm, ensuring neither of them got any bright ideas. The siren started as a distant wail, growing louder, closer until the first black and white rolled up to the curb, blue and red lights reflecting off the morning dew clinging to Nathan's front lawn. 2 officers stepped out, one immediately unfastening the strap on his holster, scanning the scene with the practiced caution of someone who had done this 100 times before. Nathan lowered his weapon, but didn't holster it yet. Federal Agent Nathan Carter, he said calmly, reaching for his badge and holding it up. Suspects attempted unlawful entry under false authority. One was armed. He nodded toward Mustache, still kneeling, hands cupped behind his back, his expression carved from cold, unyielding stone. The lead officer, a stocky man with graying hair and a thick Florida drawl, nodded sharply. We got the call. Said you had a situation with some fake ho-reps. His eyes flicked between the 2 cuffed men, gaze narrowing. Jesus. We've been getting reports of something like this all month. Same guys? Nathan asked, already knowing the answer. Looks like it. The officer turned, gesturing to his partner. Bag, the weapon. The second officer, younger, leaner, with the hyper-alertness of someone who hadn't yet had the weight of the job settle into his bones, moved swiftly, collecting the discarded pistol with gloved hands, slipping it into an evidence bag with careful efficiency. Eric still pressed against the porch railing like he thought it might somehow absorb him into the wood, licked his lips, his head jerking between Nathan and the officers. Look, okay. Listen. His voice cracked just slightly. The first real fracture in bravado he'd been barely holding together. This isn't what it looks like. All right. The lead officer snorted. Yeah, 'cause it looks like you two dumbass got caught trying to run a scam on the wrong house. Eric shook his head frantically. No, man, come on. This was just a misunderstanding. We didn't mean, save it. Nathan cut in, his voice like steel. You mean what? Didn't mean to be here? Didn't mean to flash fake badges? Didn't mean to pull a gun? Eric's mouth snapped shut. Mustache, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. His voice was low, measured, but laced with something Nathan recognized immediately. Contempt. We didn't pull a gun. Nathan's jaw tightened. You reached for it. Roy held his gaze, something dark and unrepentant flickering behind his eyes. And you people always think that's enough. The word sat heavy in the air, poisonous, deliberate. Eric turned to him sharply, eyes widening, but Roy wasn't looking at him. He was looking straight at Nathan. Nathan didn't flinch, didn't react. He had heard it all before. You people. He let the words settle, let them linger, let the weight of what Roy really meant hang between them like a loaded gun with the safety off. Then finally he exhaled slow and even. No, he said quietly. I don't think it's enough. I know it's enough. He stepped back, nodding toward the officers. Get them out of here. Eric started pleading again the second the officers pulled him off the railing, arms going rigid as cuffs clicked tight around his wrists. Come on, man. Seriously, look. We weren't going to hurt nobody, all right? We were just trying to make a little money. No harm, no foul, right? Tell that to the people you've been robbing, Nathan muttered. Mustache still wasn't saying anything, just staring at Nathan with that same unreadable expression as they hauled him to his feet. He didn't resist, didn't argue, just let them take him. Silent and simmering, the promise of some future vengeance lurking beneath the surface of his too-controlled demeanor. Nathan had seen his kind before. Predators who thought they were the ones in control. Predators who thrived on the fear of others. But this time they had knocked on the wrong door. As the officers led them toward the waiting patrol cars, the younger cop, still holding his notepad, turned to Nathan with something almost like amusement in his eyes. Man, you really lucked out. Nathan smirked, crossing his arms. He glanced toward the squad car where Eric sat slumped against the seat, staring blankly ahead like his whole world had just collapsed in real time. Then he looked at Roy, whose head was tilted slightly upward, gaze locked on some fixed point in the distance, like he was already mentally reconstructing the story in a way that made him the victim. And Nathan shook his head. Oh no, he said, voice steady assured. They're the ones who got unlucky. 3 weeks later, Nathan Carter sat in the cold, sterile silence of a Jacksonville courtroom, arms crossed over his chest, watching as the final chapter of this entire mess unfolded before him. The air was thick with something unspoken, that kind of stillness that settles in a room when people know something important is about to happen. The weight of it pressed down on every breath, on every shifting chair and quiet exhale. At the front of the room, the judge, an older man with silver-rimmed glasses and a no-nonsense demeanor, flipped through the sentencing documents with slow, deliberate precision. The rustling of paper was the only sound in the room besides the faint tapping of his gavel against the bench, rhythmic, like a countdown to something inevitable. Across the room, sitting stiff-backed at the defendant's table, were Eric and Mustache. They looked different now. Gone was the false confidence, the fake authority, the smug superiority they'd worn like a second skin that morning on Nathan's porch. Eric sat with his shoulders hunched, his hands gripping the edges of the table so tightly that his knuckles had turned a sickly shade of white. His mirrored sunglasses were long gone, leaving his bare, darting eyes exposed for the first time. Eyes that no longer held arrogance, just panic, uncertainty, the dawning realization that this wasn't a nightmare he was going to wake up from. Roy, on the other hand, looked worse. He wasn't hunched. He wasn't fidgeting. He was just sitting, still, silent, his face locked in a grimace, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles ticked his cheek. His eyes, dark and unreadable, were fixed on a single point somewhere beyond the judge, beyond the courtroom, beyond all of this, like he had already resigned himself to whatever was coming. But Savior knew that look. It wasn't surrender. It was a simmering, burning hatred, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that lingers, festers, waits. But that didn't matter now. The judge cleared his throat, bringing the weight of the room crashing back down. He set the papers down in front of him, folded his hands neatly over them, and exhaled through his nose. Then, in a voice that was steady, clear, and utterly final, he spoke. For multiple felony counts, including fraud, breaking and entering, impersonating officials, and attempted assault, he let the words sink in, his gaze moving over the two men in front of him, watching as the reality of their fate settled deep in their bones. He adjusted his glasses, then continued, 15 years. Each. The words dropped into the courtroom like a hammer. For a second, just a fraction of a second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then the weight of it hit. Eric's breath caught in his throat, his jaw twitching as his fingers flexed over the wood of the defense table, like he was physically rejecting the reality of what had just been said. His head jerked slightly, like he wanted to look at Mustache for confirmation, for reassurance, for something, but there was nothing to be found. Mustache let out a slow, shaky breath through his nose. He didn't argue, didn't fight, didn't speak. He just sat there, staring down at the polished wood of the table, his hands resting on his lap, his shoulders rigid with the kind of tension that comes when a man is bracing for impact. Nathan had seen that look before. It was the look of a man realizing he had lost everything. No plea deal, no way out. 15 years. Not a slap on the wrist. Not some bullshit community service sentence. 15 years in federal prison for a scam that had worked so well for months. For dozens of homes. For dozens of victims. How many times had they done this? How many times had they walked up to the door with their fake badges and their fake confidence, pretending to be something they weren't, pretending they had power, knowing full well that the people on the other side of that door wouldn't question them? How many people had let them in without hesitation, without suspicion, without fear, because they were afraid of seeming rude, because they had been conditioned to comply, because they didn't think they had the right to push back? Eric and Mustache had counted on that, had relied on that, and it had worked, over and over again, until they knocked on the wrong door. The judge tapped his gavel lightly against the bench. Defendants will now be remanded into federal custody. Mustache didn't react. Eric turned to look at him, his lips parting like he wanted to say something desperate, something pleading, something final, but there was nothing left to say. The cuffs clicked into place. Nathan leaned back in his chair, watching as the two men were pulled to their feet, their futures officially over. And he didn't feel an ounce of regret, because these weren't just petty criminals. They weren't just a couple of guys who had made a bad decision, who had gotten caught up in something bigger than them, who had stumbled into a life of crime. No, they were predators. They preyed on fear and trust. They dressed the part, played the role, used fake authority to push their way into people's homes and steal from them. And it had worked, until they picked the wrong house, until they knocked on his door. And the fact that they had chosen his house, that was just bad luck for them. 3 weeks had passed since the verdict. 3 weeks since Javier had sat in that courtroom, watching as Eric and Mustachio had their illusions of power shattered by the weight of real justice. 3 weeks since he had seen the way their bodies had stiffened as the cuffs clicked shut for the last time, their futures locked in just as tightly as the metal around their wrists. And now it was just another morning. Jacksonville was quiet in the early hours, the kind of stillness that only existed before the rest of the world caught up. Nathan sat on his front porch, coffee in one hand, newspaper in the other, the air thick with the smell of fresh rain and distant salt from the coast. It was peaceful, the kind of peace he had fought to protect, the kind of peace that some people took for granted. But not him. Not anymore. A car passed slowly down the street, headlights cutting to the morning haze before disappearing around the bend. The house across the road had a new for sale sign staked into the lawn, a reminder how quickly life moved for some people. and then footsteps. Soft, measured, hesitant. Nathan didn't need to look up to know who it was. "Morning, Mr. Carter." The voice belonged to Henry Whitaker, his next-door neighbor, a man in his late 50s, with a permanent scowl and an ironclad belief that the world had gone to hell the moment people stopped mowing their lawns with military precision. He was the kind of man who didn't offer pleasantries unless he had something to say. Nathan glanced over, taking a slow sip of his coffee before speaking morning. Henry shifted on his feet, glancing toward the house, his lips pressing together like he was still deciding whether to say. Then, finally he exhaled. "Heard about the trial," he said, voice gruff. "Heard they got 15 years. Nathan nodded, setting his coffee cup down on the small wooden table beside him. "They did." Henry scratched at the back of his neck, looking anywhere but at Nathan. I saw him that morning. The two guys. Thought they looked official. Thought..." He trailed off, his scowl deepening, as if he hated the words before they even left his mouth. "Thought they belonged here." Nathan didn't say anything. Henry let out a slow breath, his gaze finally settling on Nathan's. "Guess that's the problem, ain't it? Some people get to walk up to any door they want, and nobody questions them. Meanwhile, folks like you..." He trailed off again, shaking his head. "That ain't right." Nathan held his stare for a long moment, then simply nodded. "No, it's not." Henry nodded back a slow, thoughtful dip of his head. And then just like that he was gone, his footsteps carried him back toward his own house, the screen door creaking as he stepped inside. Nathan sat there for a while longer, staring at the empty street, the quiet houses, the world that had gone back to normal. But he knew better. Nothing ever really went back to normal. Because the truth was, Eric and Roy weren't the only ones out there. There would always be more than people who counted on fear, on silence, on the weight of old habits and unspoken rules to keep their power intact. People who walked into spaces like they belonged, knowing no one would challenge them. But sometimes, just sometimes, they knocked on the wrong door. Nathan took another sip of his coffee, let the warmth settle in his chest, and allowed himself a small, quiet thought. Next time he'd be ready. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons, heartfelt empathy.